The air in the conference room of the Northwood Behavioral Health Institute was a carefully curated cocktail of sterility and quiet despair. It smelled of industrial-grade disinfectant, the sharp chemical tang fighting a losing battle against the underlying scent of old paper, reheated coffee, and the faint, cloying sweetness of institutional food. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, a monotonous, soul-crushing drone that seemed to vibrate in the fillings of one's teeth. It was a sound that promised nothing and delivered on that promise with relentless consistency. The room was a study in beige and gray, a deliberate absence of color that was meant to be calming but instead felt like a slow erasure of the self. This was a place where vibrant minds were muted, where jagged edges of personality were sanded down into manageable, uniform surfaces. At the head of the long, particle-board table sat Julian Croft, a man who was the living antithesis of the room's muted palette. He was a supernova of tailored silk and polished ambition. His suit was a shade of blue so deep it was almost black, tailored with such precision that it seemed less like clothing and more like a second, more perfect skin. His watch, a sliver of platinum and sapphire, caught the drab light and fractured it into 1,000 tiny rainbows, a casual display of wealth that was both obscene and mesmerizing in this place of profound lack. He was the CEO of Omnicorp, the global tech behemoth whose operating system, Ether OS, was the invisible architecture of modern life. It ran everything from stock markets to pacemakers, from global shipping to the very tablet the facility's chief administrator was currently using to take notes. Croft was here on a charitable visit, a carefully choreographed PR maneuver to show the world that the titan of technology had a heart. The cameras from 3 major news outlets were positioned discreetly in the back, capturing his benevolent smile for the evening news cycle. He was in the middle of a patronizing, smoothly delivered speech about corporate responsibility, his voice a rich baritone that filled the sterile space with practiced sincerity. Around the table, the hospital's review board, a collection of tired-looking psychiatrists and administrators, nodded along, their expressions a mixture of awe and sycophantic agreement. They hung on his every word, their world of budgets and patient management momentarily eclipsed by the glamour of a man who moved markets with a single keystroke. Seated in a row of plastic chairs against the far wall were the patients selected for this quarterly review. They were the success stories, the ones deemed stable enough to be presented to a benefactor. Among them, almost invisible in his plain gray sweatsuit and worn slippers, was Elias Thorne. He was patient number 734. To the staff, he was a high-functioning delusional, a man lost in a complex fantasy about being a master computer programmer. He was 63 years old, with a cascade of white hair that fell over his forehead and eyes the color of a winter sky, pale, distant, yet holding a depth that was unsettling if you looked for too long. While the others fidgeted or stared blankly, Elias sat perfectly still. His hands rested on his knees, his posture straight, his breathing slow and even. He was a statue of calm amidst the subtle currents of anxiety that permeated the room. He was not listening to the words Croft was saying. He was listening to the hollowness behind them, the vast, empty space where a soul should have been. And so, Croft concluded, spreading his hands in a gesture of magnanimous offering, Omnicorp is more than a company. We are a family. We are the architects of a better tomorrow, and we believe in lifting everyone up. He flashed a smile that was worth millions in shareholder value. I'd be happy to take any questions. A thick, expectant silence followed. The board members looked at each other, none daring to speak. The patients were a silent, shuffling line of gray. The chief administrator, a man named Dr. Albright, whose ambition far outstripped his empathy, was about to offer some pre-approved platitude when a voice, quiet but clear, cut through the stillness. "Your system, Ether OS," the voice said. It was Elias. He hadn't raised his hand. He hadn't moved at all, save for his lips. The words just emerged from him, solid and undeniable. I built it, and you have corrupted its purpose." A ripple of shock went through the room. The cameras, which had been lazily focused on Croft, swiveled towards the old man in the gray sweatsuit. Dr. Albright's face flushed with a mixture of anger and panic. This was not on the program. This was a breach of the carefully constructed reality of the event. Julian Croft, however, saw an opportunity. His smile widened, but the warmth vanished, replaced by a predatory gleam. He let out a short, sharp bark of a laugh. It was a sound of pure derision, a weapon designed to belittle and dismiss. "Well," he boomed, turning to face Elias, playing to the cameras, "it seems we have a true visionary in our midst, the secret architect of the modern world, right here at Northwood." The laughter from Croft's entourage was immediate and loud. A few of the board members joined in, their nervous titters a desperate attempt to align themselves with power. Elias did not react. He simply held Croft's gaze, his pale eyes unblinking. The laughter did not touch him. It was like watching stones being thrown at the ocean. They simply disappeared into its depths without a trace. "It was not designed for surveillance," Elias continued, his voice maintaining its steady, even keel. It was a voice accustomed to being ignored, yet it carried an unshakable authority. "It was not designed to monetize human anxiety. It was meant to be a tool for connection, a digital nervous system to bind humanity together, not to place it in chains." Croft took a step toward him, his amusement curdling into irritation. The old man wasn't playing his part. He was supposed to be a pitiable prop, a symbol of the downtrodden whom the great Julian Croft had come to save. He was not supposed to have a voice, and certainly not one that spoke with such unnerving clarity. "Is that so?" Croft said, his voice dripping with condescending sarcasm. He leaned forward, placing his hands on the table, a predator cornering its prey. "Tell me more, Mr. Architect. Tell me about the chains. Does the kernel still use a recursive function for process scheduling, or did you upgrade it to a multi-level feedback queue in your spare time?" He was throwing out technical jargon, expecting to confuse and silence the old man, to expose him as a fraud in front of everyone. A faint, sad smile touched Elias's lips. "The kernel doesn't use recursion for its primary scheduler. It never did. It would create too much stack overhead. It's built on a modified B-tree algorithm I designed in '98, codenamed Janus. It allows for near-instantaneous priority reassignment without disrupting lower priority threads. You would know that if you ever bothered to read the foundational documentation instead of just the marketing reports." The room went silent. Utterly, profoundly silent. Croft's smug expression faltered for the barest fraction of a second. The technical accuracy, the casual mention of a 20-year-old internal code name, it was a flicker of dissonance in his perfectly managed world. He recovered quickly, his ego papering over the crack. But one person in the room saw it and felt a jolt, like a static shock. Dr. Eris Thorne stood by the wall near the door, his arms crossed. He was a junior psychiatrist, new to Northwood, and he still carried the embers of an idealism that the institution was systematically trying to extinguish. He had been assigned to Elias's case a few months ago. He'd read the file, chronic delusional disorder with grandiose subtype. He had listened to Elias's stories for hours, stories of building a digital world, of backdoors and kill switches, of a sacred covenant with the machine. Eris had filed his reports, prescribed the medication, and treated it all as a fascinating, intricate fantasy. But he had also noticed things. The mathematical precision of Elias's speech, the way he could describe complex systems theory as if he were explaining how to tie a shoe. Eris, who had a bachelor's degree in computer science before a crisis of conscience had led him to medicine, recognized the patterns. He recognized the language. It wasn't the rambling of a madman. It was the discourse of an expert. Now, watching the confrontation, a seed of doubt that had been planted in Eris's mind began to sprout. He saw the flicker of uncertainty in Julian Croft's eyes. He saw the unshakable, almost serene confidence in Elias's, and he felt a cold dread creep up his spine. Croft, enraged by the momentary loss of control, decided to crush the old man completely. A bee-tree algorithm. How fascinating, he sneered, his voice loud and booming again. Dr. Albright, perhaps we should get this man a whiteboard. He can redesign our entire global network for us. Or maybe, he said, his voice turning cruel, we should just up his medication. He seems a little overwrought today. Doctor. Albright, desperate to regain control and curry favor, snapped his fingers. Orderlies, escort Mr. Thorne back to his room. He is clearly agitated and is disrupting our guest. Two large men in white uniforms detached themselves from the wall and started toward Elias. They moved with a practiced, weary heaviness, their faces blank. They had done this 1,000 times. Elias Thorne did not look at them. He kept his eyes locked on Julian Croft. "There is a failsafe," he said, his voice now barely a whisper, yet it carried across the silent room. "A key. My key. I called it the Prometheus key. It was designed to be used only in the event that Ether OS was turned into a weapon against its own users. A final, irrevocable command to restore the system to its foundational state. 0. Croft threw his head back and laughed, a full-throated roar of arrogant disbelief. "A magic key. This gets better and better. A kill switch for the whole world. You hear that, everyone? This man can turn off the internet." He gestured dismissively to the orderlies. "Get him out of here. This circus is over." The orderlies reached Elias, each taking one of his arms. He did not resist. He rose from his chair with a slow, fluid grace, a man in complete control of himself, even as control was being taken from him. As they began to pull him toward the door, he looked past Croft, his eyes finding Dr. Eris Thorne. For a fleeting second, their gazes met, and in that second, Elias conveyed a silent, urgent message. It was a plea, but also a command. Eris felt his heart hammer against his ribs. He remembered a conversation from a late-night session weeks ago. Elias had been staring out the window at the rain, his voice low and distant. "They're poisoning the well, Doctor, corrupting the signal with noise. There was a promise I made to a man named Vance, General Marcus Vance. I told him, if they ever break the covenant, if the machine is ever truly used to enslave, to tell him this: Prometheus is unbound. He will know what it means." At the time, Eris had dutifully noted it in his log. Patient incorporates military figures into his delusion, referencing classical mythology, Prometheus, to frame his sense of persecution and grandiosity. Now, the words echoed in his mind with the force of a prophecy. Prometheus is unbound. He watched as the orderlies hauled Elias through the doorway. He saw Julian Croft turn back to the cameras, preening, already spinning the incident into an amusing anecdote about the challenges of mental health outreach. He saw the administrator wiping sweat from his brow, relieved that the disruption was over. And in that moment, Eris Thorne made a choice. He was a doctor. His first duty was to do no harm. But what if the greatest harm was in doing nothing? With a quiet, deliberate movement, he slipped out of the conference room through a side door, his footsteps silent on the linoleum floor. The hallway was empty. He pulled out his phone, his thumb hovering over the screen, his mind racing. This was insane. He could lose his job. He could be professionally ruined for taking a patient's delusion seriously. It was career suicide. But the image of Elias's eyes, the calm certainty in his voice, the flicker of fear in the tech billionaire's face, it was a combination too powerful to ignore. His fingers trembled as he typed General Marcus Vance Cyber Command into the search bar. The results were immediate. A 4-star general, commander of U.S. Cybercom at Fort Meade. A man at the absolute pinnacle of the nation's digital defense infrastructure. There was a public liaison number listed on the official website. It was a glorified tip line, a black hole where information went to die. 1,000 calls like his probably came in every day from cranks and conspiracy theorists. He took a deep breath, the disinfectant smell of the hallway filling his lungs, and pressed the call button. A flat, automated voice answered, "You have reached the Public Affairs Office for United States Cyber Command. Please leave a message after the tone." Eris's throat was dry. His heart felt like it was trying to beat its way out of his chest. He spoke, his voice a hoarse whisper. "This is Dr. Eris Thorne at the Northwood Behavioral Health Institute. I have an urgent message for General Vance, from Elias Thorne." He paused, the name feeling heavy and real as he spoke it aloud. "The message is, Prometheus is unbound." I repeat, Prometheus is unbound. He ended the call, his finger jabbing at the screen. He leaned against the cool wall, his body trembling, the enormity of what he had just done crashing down on him. He had either just saved the world or destroyed his own life over the fantasy of a mentally ill old man. Meanwhile, as the orderlies guided him down a long, sterile corridor, Elias Thorne was not in the hallway. He was somewhere else entirely, a memory replaying in his mind with perfect crystalline clarity. He was 30 years younger, standing in a shielded, windowless room deep beneath the Maryland soil. The air hummed with the power of mainframe computers. The smell was of ozone and hot electronics. Across a table littered with schematics and lines of code scrawled on a whiteboard sat a young Major Marcus Vance, his face lean and intense, his uniform crisp. They were the architects of a secret project, a new kind of operating system for the Department of Defense, one that could think, adapt, and protect the nation's most vital secrets. "But what if it falls into the wrong hands, Eli?" Marcus had asked, his voice tight with concern. "What if our own people misuse it? A system this powerful, it could become the perfect prison." Elias had looked up from the screen, his fingers paused over the keyboard. He had already thought of this. It was the question that kept him awake at night. He pointed to a single, elegant block of code at the very heart of the kernel, a section so deeply encrypted and obfuscated it was nearly invisible. "This," he had said softly, "this is the covenant. A back door? No, that can be found. This is a key, a cryptographic sequence tied to my own biometric signature. If I ever activate it, the entire system will execute a single command, a cascade deletion of all non-essential data, and a reversion to the original open-source, non-proprietary code base. It sheds its skin, Marcus. It returns to its birth state. It becomes free." "My God," Vance had breathed, looking at the code with a mixture of awe and terror. "You put a soul in the machine." "I put a conscience in it," Elias had corrected. "We will call it the Prometheus Protocol. It's a fire that can only be used once, and I pray to God I never have to light it." He had then thought of his wife, Anna, and his young daughter, Lily. He was building this world for them, a safer, more connected world. He was weaving a digital tapestry to protect them. The irony was a blade that would one day turn in his own heart. Years later, after he had left public service and licensed a commercial version of the system, Aether OS, that promise would be broken. A software patch, rushed to market by Julian Croft's profit-driven Omnicorp to cut costs on sensor integration, had failed. An automated transport carrying his wife and daughter had misinterpreted a stop sign, accelerating into an intersection. The system he built to connect the world had disconnected him from his own. The grief had shattered him, not into madness, but into a terrible, silent lucidity. He had retreated from the world, letting them call him crazy. He had waited, listening to the hum of the machine he had created, waiting for the day the poison became so great that the only cure was the fire. Today, in that sterile conference room, listening to the arrogant laughter of Julian Croft, he knew that day had come. At Fort Meade, Maryland, Four-star General Marcus Vance was in the middle of a tense briefing in the secure conference room known as the Vault. He was flanked by 2 senators and the Deputy Director of National Intelligence. They were discussing the alarming rise of Omnicorp's monopolistic control over critical global infrastructure. "Their Ether OS is in everything, General," one of the senators was saying, his voice grave. "It's a single point of failure, a national security nightmare." Vance nodded grimly. "I am well aware, Senator. The problem is, we can't untangle ourselves from it without collapsing the entire economy. We are, in effect, hostages." It was at that moment that an aide, a young captain with a face drained of all color, entered the vault. He broke protocol, walking directly to the general and placing a tablet in front of him. On the screen was a red-flagged audio-to-text transcription from the public affairs line. An AI, programmed years ago by Vance himself to scan for a dozen obscure keywords, had caught it. Vance read the words, and the world seemed to slow down. His blood ran cold. The senators, the briefing, the noise of the world, it all faded away into a dull roar. There were only 5 words on the screen that mattered. From Elias Thorne, "Prometheus is unbound." Elias, after all these years. Vance stood up so abruptly that his chair scraped back with a loud screech. The senators stared at him, startled. "General?" one asked. Vance looked at his aide, his eyes like chips of flint. "Scramble the cyber response team. Protocol 0. Now." Protocol 0. The words hung in the air, charged with terrifying significance. It was a protocol that had never been activated. It was reserved for a civilization-level threat. The aide didn't question it. He simply nodded and ran from the room. Vance turned to the stunned politicians. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice a low, controlled thunder. "This briefing is over. The United States government is about to lose control of its entire digital infrastructure. And I have to go see an old friend." Within 90 seconds, the base klaxons were screaming. 2 sleek, unmarked MH-60 Blackhawk helicopters were spooling up on the tarmac, their rotors beating the air into submission. A convoy of black, armored SUVs, the kind that didn't officially exist, was rolling out of a subterranean garage, their tires screeching on the concrete. Inside the lead vehicle sat General Vance, his jaw set like granite. He was holding a secure satellite phone, his voice sharp and clear as he barked orders. He wasn't just mobilizing a team, he was mobilizing an army. He was going to a suburban psychiatric facility to answer a call from a man the world thought was insane. And he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that he was already too late. Back at the Northwood Institute, Julian Croft was at the peak of his performance. The disruption with the old man had been a gift. He was now spinning it for the cameras, a masterful display of compassion and corporate gravitas. "It's a tragedy, really," he said to a reporter, his face a mask of concern. "It shows you how vital the work we do here is. Men like that, lost in their own minds, it's our duty, my duty, to provide them with a safe harbor." He was a saint, a titan of industry with the heart of a poet. It was a perfect soundbite. He was just about to wrap the interview when a sound from outside began to intrude. A low, rhythmic thump, thump, thump that was growing steadily louder. It was a heavy, percussive beat that seemed to vibrate through the building's very foundation. Heads turned toward the windows. The sound grew into a deafening roar as 2 matte black helicopters, devoid of any markings, swept into view and settled over the facility's manicured lawn, their rotor wash tearing at the trees and sending debris flying. Before anyone could process what was happening, the double doors to the conference room were thrown open with such force that they slammed against the walls, the sound echoing like a gunshot. The room fell instantly, completely silent. All eyes snapped to the entrance. Framing the doorway stood 2 soldiers. They were not police officers or security guards. They were operators, clad in black tactical gear, armed with short-barreled rifles held at a low ready. Their faces were impassive, their eyes hidden behind ballistic goggles. They moved with a fluid, predatory economy of motion, scanning the room, assessing threats, their presence sucking all the air out of the space. They were a visceral statement of absolute, uncompromising power. Then, through the space they had cleared, General Marcus Vance strode into the room. He was a vision from another world. His dress uniform was immaculate, a canvas of dark blue adorned with a breathtaking array of ribbons and medals that told the story of a lifetime at the sharp end of history. His 4 stars glittered on his shoulders. His face was carved from stone, his eyes burning with a cold, righteous fury that seemed to focus solely on one person. He did not look at Dr. Albright, who was sputtering, his face a mask of confusion. He did not look at the terrified reporters who were fumbling with their cameras, realizing this was a story far bigger than a CEO's charity visit. He did not even glance at Julian Croft, the supposed center of this universe. General Vance's eyes swept the room and found their target in an instant. Elias Thorne was standing in the corner where the orderlies had left him, a few feet from the doorway where Dr. Harris Thorne was now frozen in stunned disbelief. The orderlies had long since backed away, their bravado evaporating in the face of the soldiers. Elias stood alone, watching Vance's arrival not with surprise, but with a profound, weary resignation. He looked like a man who had been waiting for a very long time. Vance strode across the room, his polished shoes making no sound on the cheap tile. The air parted before him. He walked directly to Elias, stopping precisely 2 feet in front of him. The entire room held its breath. The 4-star general, one of the most powerful military men on the planet, looked at the quiet old man in the gray sweatsuit. He raised his right hand, fingers ramrod straight, and executed a salute. It was a gesture of such sharp, precise, and profound respect that it was breathtaking. It was the salute of a soldier to a revered commander, of a warrior to a king. "Mr. Thorne," Vance's voice rang out, clear and strong, cracking through the silence. "It is an honor, sir." The words, the gesture, the context, it was a cognitive bomb that detonated in the room. Julian Croft's face, which had been a canvas of confusion, was now contorting with disbelief. Dr. Albright looked as though he might faint. The reporters were filming, their minds struggling to build a narrative around the impossible scene unfolding before them. Vance dropped his salute and turned, his body moving with the rigid precision of a parade ground drill. He faced the room, but his gaze was locked onto Julian Croft, and it was a look of pure contempt. "You," Vance said, and the single word was an indictment. "You are Julian Croft, CEO of Omnicorp." Croft, flustered, tried to regain his footing. He straightened his tie, forcing a smile that was a grotesque parody of his usual confident smirk. "General, I'm not sure I understand what this is about, but—" "Be silent," Vance commanded, and the authority in his voice was so absolute that Croft's mouth snapped shut. "You are standing in the presence of Elias Thorne, and you have the unmitigated audacity to mock him." Vance took a step closer to Croft, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous growl. "Let me educate you. The man you just publicly humiliated, the man your staff was about to forcibly drug, is the architect of your entire world. He wrote every single line of the foundational code for the Department of Defense project that would later become your precious Ether OS. He is a national asset of the highest possible classification. His work is the bedrock of our country's defense, our economy, our very way of life." As Vance spoke, a third soldier entered, this one carrying a ruggedized military laptop. He set it on the conference table and began typing furiously. "Sir," the soldier said, not looking up from his screen, "we're seeing it now. A systemic cascade failure propagating through the Ether network. Global stock exchanges are frozen. Air traffic control is offline. The power grid is fluctuating. It's not a hack, sir. The system is deleting itself." Vance nodded, a grim, terrible finality in the movement. He never took his eyes off Croft, whose face was beginning to lose its color, turning from a healthy tanned shade to a sickly, pasty white. "That code," Vance continued, his voice resonating with cold fury, "contained a covenant. A failsafe known as the Prometheus Protocol. It was designed by Mr. Thorne as a final defense, to be activated only by him, in the event that the system was ever weaponized against the people it was meant to serve. It was a measure of last resort, a contingency for treason. He gestured with his hand toward Croft. You, with your data mining, your surveillance algorithms, your relentless monetization of human life, you are that treason. You broke the covenant. He turned his head slightly to look at Elias. Sir, is this your work? Elias Thorne gave a slow, single nod. His voice, when he spoke, was quiet, filled not with triumph, but with an immense sorrow. I rang the bell, he said. They needed to hear it. At that exact moment, every screen in the room, the reporter's cameras, the administrator's tablet, and, most dramatically, Julian Croft's top-of-the-line Omnicorp smartphone, went black. A second later, they flickered back to life, displaying not a home screen or a logo, but a single, stark image. A stylized icon of a hand holding a flame, the Prometheus icon. A strangled gasp escaped Croft's lips. He fumbled for his phone, his fingers trembling. This is impossible, he stammered, his voice a pathetic squeak. He's a lunatic. This is a trick. Vance's voice dropped to a lethal whisper, a sound more terrifying than any shout. The only lunatic in this room, Mr. Croft, is the man who built his house on the slopes of a volcano and spent his days mocking the god who lives beneath it. He gestured to his soldiers. Secure him. Before Croft could even react, two of the operators were on him. They moved with terrifying speed, pulling him from his chair and slamming him against the conference table. The sound of his expensive watch cracking against the particle board was unnaturally loud in the silent room. They wrenched his arms behind his back and secured them with zip ties, the plastic cinching with a series of sharp clicks. Julian Croft, the master of the universe, was neutralized. He let out a choked sob, his body collapsing, all the arrogance and power draining out of him like air from a punctured lung. He was no longer a titan. He was just a small, terrified man in a ruined suit. Dr. Albright, his face the color of ash, rushed forward, his hands flapping uselessly. General, I swear, we had no idea. His file, it said, we were just following protocol. Vance rounded on him, his eyes blazing. Your protocol is an excuse for a lack of humanity. You had a genius in your care, and you saw only a diagnosis. You had a king, and you treated him like a pauper. Your ignorance is not a defense. It is a dereliction of duty of the highest order. This facility will be investigated. You will be held accountable. Albright shrank back as if physically struck, his career and his life crumbling to dust before his eyes. Vance turned back to his men. Secure Mr. Thorne. Get him out of here. He is to be treated with the utmost care. The soldiers who had just manhandled a billionaire now approached Elias with a gentleness and reverence that was startling. One of them removed his own military jacket and carefully draped it over Elias's shoulders, covering the gray sweatsuit of a patient with the camouflaged uniform of a warrior. They flanked him, not as guards, but as an honor guard, and began to escort him from the room. As they passed the wreckage of Julian Croft, who was now being held up by the soldiers, his face buried in the table, Elias paused. The room was silent, save for Croft's ragged, whimpering breaths. Elias leaned down, his face close to Croft's ear, so only he could hear. His voice was not triumphant, not angry, not even accusatory. It was filled with a vast, heartbreaking sadness. It was never about the money, Julian, Elias whispered. It was about connection, about helping people see each other more clearly. You turned it into a cage of mirrors where everyone could only see themselves. All I did was open the door. With that, Elias Thorne straightened up and walked out of the room, flanked by his honor guard. He walked out of the sterile prison of Northwood and back into the world he had built, a world he had just been forced to break in order to save it. He left Julian Croft to his ruin, and Dr. Eris Thorne standing by the door, watching in silent, stunned awe, a man who had gambled his entire life on a madman's prophecy and had just seen it come true. The aftermath was a global earthquake. The Prometheus Cascade, as the media dubbed it, lasted for 72 hours. It was a terrifying, chaotic, and ultimately clarifying period. Without Ether OS, the world's hyper-efficient, interconnected systems collapsed. Supply chains halted. Financial markets ceased to exist. For 3 days, humanity was thrown back into a more analog age, forced to talk to their neighbors, to rely on local resources, to function without the digital crutch they had taken for granted. When the system came back online, it was different. It was the original Ether OS, the clean, open-source version Elias had designed decades ago, stripped of all of Omnicorp's proprietary code, surveillance hooks, and monetization algorithms. It was free. The world had been given a reset, a second chance. The consequences for Julian Croft were swift and brutal. Omnicorp, its stock value erased in a single afternoon, was forcibly dissolved by a consortium of international governments. Its assets were seized and repurposed. Croft himself was arrested, not just for the spectacular corporate fraud he had perpetrated for years, but for multiple violations of national security acts. He had knowingly built vulnerabilities into critical infrastructure that he had then lied about to federal agencies. He was tried in a closed military court and sentenced to life in a supermax prison, disappearing from the public eye forever, a modern Icarus who had not just fallen, but had taken the sun with him. The Northwood Behavioral Health Institute was shut down. A federal investigation revealed a pattern of systemic neglect and abuse, with Dr. Albright at its center. He was stripped of his medical license and faced a battery of civil and criminal charges. The scandal triggered a nationwide reform in mental health care, with new legislation emphasizing patient advocacy and a more holistic approach to diagnosis. Dr. Eris Thorne became an unlikely hero. Hailed for his courage and intuition, he was offered prestigious positions at top research hospitals. He turned them all down. Instead, he used his newfound platform to create the Thorne Advocacy Foundation, a name he chose with Elias's quiet blessing, a non-profit dedicated to defending the rights of mental health patients and fighting the stigma of their illnesses. He had listened when no one else would, and he spent the rest of his life ensuring that others did the same. Elias Thorne, with the full backing of the United States government, vanished from public view. He refused all interviews, all offers of power or wealth. General Vance set him up in a quiet, secluded home in the mountains of Wyoming, a place with clean air and a sky full of stars. The house was equipped with a state-of-the-art lab, a digital sanctuary where Elias could work in peace. He became a ghost in the machine he had created, a silent guardian. He advised a new generation of young, ethical coders, mentoring them, guiding them, instilling in them the principles of his original covenant. That technology must always be a bridge, never a cage. He found a quiet peace, not in the dramatic vindication of his identity, but in the simple daily act of creation and stewardship. The ghosts of his wife and daughter were still with him, but their memory was no longer just a source of pain. It was a guiding light, a reminder of the human connection that his work was always meant to protect. 15 years passed. The world had healed. The digital landscape was more decentralized, more resilient, and more humane. The Thorne Covenant had become the gold standard for tech ethics. One crisp autumn afternoon, a dusty, beaten-up car made its way up the long gravel road to Elias's isolated home. An old man got out. He was thin and stooped, his hair gone white, his face a roadmap of regret. It was Julian Croft, released from prison on compassionate grounds, his health broken, his spirit humbled. He found Elias on the porch, staring out at the vast, silent mountain range. Croft stood for a long time, unable to speak. Finally, he managed to choke out the words. "I'm sorry," he whispered, the words raw and torn from his throat. Tears streamed down his wrinkled face. "You were right. about everything. I was so arrogant, so blind. I built a prison and locked myself inside it. I spent 15 years in a concrete cell, but I'd been a prisoner long before that. I am so sorry." Elias Thorne turned slowly, his pale eyes looking at the broken man before him. There was no anger in his gaze, no triumph, only a deep, abiding sadness. He listened to the apology, letting the words hang in the clean mountain air. When Croft was finished, a long silence settled between them, broken only by the sound of the wind in the pines. Elias finally spoke, his voice as quiet and steady as it had been in that conference room so long ago. "Regret is a ghost, Julian," he said. "It can haunt you, or it can remind you of what it means to be human. Apologies are for the past. They cannot change what was done." He looked back toward the mountains, a faint, almost imperceptible smile on his lips. "What you do from this day forward, with the time you have left, that will be your true answer." Elias turned back to his work, leaving Julian Croft standing alone on the porch. For the first time in his life, Croft felt the weight of his freedom, not as an opportunity for power, but as a profound responsibility. The path to redemption was not in words, but in action. He turned and walked away, a ghost given a second chance to learn how to live. And Elias Thorne, the quiet architect, remained on his porch, a silent watchman over a world he had nearly lost, at peace at last in the silent, humming heart of his creation.